So we'll now spend some time talking about Kenai River, Alaska. It so happens that I am located on Kenai River, Alaska. It's dark outside my office right now because I'm recording at night. But if it wasn't dark outside, I would literally see the river from here. So Kenai River is near and dear to my heart. Located as I am in Soldotna, or as it's known in English, Soldotna. The Kenai River is known as Katnu in the Dena'ina language, on whose homelands the Kenai River is, or this portion of the Kenai River. And it is a beautiful and a wonderful place. The Kenai River, you can describe it in simplistic terms, right? You could say, well, it's 60 miles long, a few hundred feet of elevation change as you go along. It drains about 2,000 miles square. It's partly the result of glacial uplift and glacial recession that happened over time. You could say all these physiological facts, but at the end of the day, you really need to see the Kenai to experience it. I remember the first time I saw it, just marveling at the color of the glacier-influenced waters. So it's a place very beloved for myself. It's a place very beloved for a lot of people. And it's certainly a place that's marketed that way from a tourism perspective. Chambers of commerce and different kind of economic groups, for example, market it. For example, we sometimes say, you'll see this logo sometimes on certain products that are like flyers and like catalogs and different things that are put out that you can find at like visitor centers across Kenai Peninsula, and it'll say like the Kenai, Alaska's playground, and you can like download an app related to it and stuff like that. So it's something that we kind of like heavily promote, this idea of the Kenai Peninsula, which by the way includes Seward, as kind of this tourism hotspot. And that's not just because of the Kenai River, right? It's also because of, again, Seward, huge. Homer, also huge as a tourism destination. But certainly fishing on the Kenai River is a major part of what we mean when we say things like, oh, Alaska's playground. This is just a quick note on salmon catch over time in Alaska. This is in millions of fish. This is from 1896, which was early in the days of the canneries, relatively speaking, up to 1980. As you can see, we've had big waves. This time period right here in the 60s is when Fish and Game started to really feel like there was a problem with salmon numbers. And then right here in the 70s is when they started to enforce actual limits on salmon, which for all intents and purposes didn't exist previously. So we'll talk more about that in a minute. But the Kenai is certainly a place where sports fishing is a major part of a major economic driver, among many others. Commercial fishing here is also very, very large. And there's a lot of other businesses as well that are really big here. Oil is an operation here. Other kinds of tourism, people just camping and things like that, as well as a million other things, right? But certainly sports fishing is a major part of communities like Soldotna, for sure, communities like Kenai, for sure. Certainly for communities like Cooper Landing, if you've ever spent time there, right? Fishing is a big part of some of these communities, some more than others. Again, I use Cooper Landing as an example of one that's heavily salmon related. Sports fishers catch about on average 200,000 sockeyes or reds on Kenai River a year. So that's not counting kings or anything else or silvers, that's solely reds. So that's a lot, to say the least. But even though we think of it now as a place that's very much famed across the United States, if not the world, as kind of a major place to catch salmon. And it is, in fact, the largest salmon to have ever been caught that wasn't caught by a commercial boat. So one that was caught by like a sports fisher was caught on the Kenai River. So it's, it's a well-known fishing spot and a place that people travel the world over to come see. Although that's the case, the history of fishing on the Kenai, that little bit of fishing, that like last few decades of sports fishing, that is like a little drop, right? That's a little Mona Lisa's eyeball versus the whole Mona Lisa, right? A little drop in the bucket as far as the length of time it's been being fished. We don't know for sure how long Kenai River has been being fished by human beings, but we know at least since, give or take, 1000 BC or 0 BC. That's been being fished up to the present. So by native people for centuries and indeed millennia prior to the arrival of Euro-Americans or white people. So as one example of groups that were fishing it far, far before it became a sports fishing destination, Kenai River was fished in 300 AD, for example, at a site that we call Kenai River Village, but which is a riverine Kachemak site. So riverine Kachemak is a culture we can recognize in the archaeological record, a group of people that have a similar type of technology. It's somewhat similar to Marine Kachemak, the group of people down in Homer during this same time period. It's a little hard to say who the riverine Kachemak people became, like where that group went and who they became as far as modern groups. That's a debate among anthropologists as well as other people. I won't take a position on it here, but I will say that there was people living on the Kenai from about 1000 AD to, or 1000 BC to about 1000 AD that had villages that were right on the Kenai River, and that tended to be clustered closely together, that had all sorts of different types of stone technology that they were using, not the least of which is this very characteristic notch stone, of which there can be like hundreds at a single site, that people were, as far as we can ascertain, people were using that to tie those onto nets to weight down the nets so that they could pull them upstream, or no, I'm sorry, downstream, probably on a kayak with the floater on the end, and then catch the salmon as they're swimming upstream. So people were fishing salmon this way with these notch stones. And also we can tell that they were fishing salmon because archaeological excavation finds countless salmon skeletons there. After the riverine Kachemak people, there was Dena'ina people fishing on the Kenai River. I say after riverine Kachemak, I don't love that language because that suggests a conclusion on who riverine Kachemak are ancestral to, and I don't take that position. So I'll just say that villages that look more like the more modern Dena'ina villages, the ones that later popped up in this area, arose shortly thereafter. So by 1000 AD, you kind of have the more modern version of Dena'ina villages that we found in the archaeological record, ones that looked very similar to the villages that existed when Russians arrived, as far as in the chith, kind of traditional log homes. But what we know for sure is that these villages, these Dena'ina villages, were very much often built on where the salmon were. For example, here at Kenai Peninsula College, there was Shlakaka, the Saikak Creek village, which was abandoned around 1600 before Russians got here, and we don't really know why, but it's at a prime fishing spot that's still used as a prime fishing spot by fishers today. People used weirs, so made out of like made out of branches and out of using root as twine. And they would like trap fish in here, vault them over to the side. They'd be clubbed and gutted and cleaned and then put up and stored in these like underground cache pits. They had other ways of fishing too. So fishing on the Kenai River has been happening for a very, very, very long time that way, way, way predates the arrival of Europeans into the area and way predates the arrival of tourism. So when you think of sort of tourism on the Kenai and fishing, you need to think of it as something in context of thousands of years of fishing. And I think that adds, if I might get on my soapbox just a little bit, sort of a moral imperative for folks that fish on the Kenai to show respect to the fish, to the place, acknowledge that humans lived and have lived sustainably on this river for thousands of years, and that it is now imperative on our current generation to figure out how to do so, as challenging as it may be. I'm now going to talk a little bit about the history of how the fishing tourism industry developed, and also, partly because it is an anthropology class, kind of also look at subsistence fishing at the same time and how that, and in relation to native communities. This is going to be a super just like overview. There's a lot I'm not talking about. I just wanted to make you aware of a few things that happened in that history, which may be relevant to sort of thinking through our modern sort of Kenai as fishing site kind of thinking. There's going to be a lot of dates here. I don't expect you to know them, like really at all for the test. That just look for the general trends, okay? All right, so by the late 1700s, early 1800s, Russians have entered the Kenai Peninsula as part of fur colonialism and set up things like the redoubt at Kisilov River and the redoubt at Kenai River. There's the Battle of Kenai at 1797. Russians are extirpated from the area due to by Dena'ina forces. Eventually, Russians do re-enter the area, but eventually the land is sold not that much longer after to the United States. The history of the sale of Alaska, a land that for the most part was now occupied, to the United States is beyond the scope of this lecture. But shortly after the arrival of sort of Americans into the area, there was the beginning of the canneries. Canneries were established in large part by what we sometimes call the railroad barons, but basically people who had made their money from railroad speculation and development in the lower 48 and came up and invested in these salmon canning operations where you would have catch a bunch of salmon, put them into cans and ship them other places as a great source of protein. Generally speaking, these commercial canning operations had kind of a three-tiered labor system where you had white people who would make X amount of dollars for working for the cannery. Alaska Native people would make half of that. Asian people would make another half again of that, so a quarter of what white people were making. So it was very much a racialized kind of tiered labor. And generally speaking, Asian people had the worst kind of work that they were doing. But the work in general was exhausting, often processing many fish per hour, really kind of backbreaking kind of labor. At first, the way they were getting the fish was in large part through large fish traps like the one you see here. This was something that upset certain parties within Alaska. And that indeed is, in a weird way, part of how we became a state. There was multiple things that fed into us becoming a state. But one thing that led into us becoming a state was that there was people pushing for these large canning operations to be curtailed, or particularly the fish traps, because it was making it hard for people that wanted to do subsistence fishing, go down to the river and catch some food for their family. So when the state became a state, the first thing the state legislature did, well, not the first thing maybe, but like one of the first things was they outlawed these kind of like big commercial fish traps. And so kind of an interesting part of our history. As a result of that, the commercial canning operations in the 60s shifted to what we think of them as now, or at least closer to what we think of now, as far as like vessels that go out and catch salmon and then bring them back. The other thing that shifted in the 60s was that we shifted from a mainly canning kind of model to like refrigeration, obviously, which really changes things as far as like frozen salmon. By the 60s, it's clear that salmon are in trouble. Fish and Game notices by 1968, they've established sonar and start to be able to do math of like kind of how many reds are actually making it up the river and start to enforce more restriction, start moving towards more restrictions. By 1969, though, they start to enforce things a little bit more as far as limits, but you're still allowed to do snagging, which basically, although now they limit it to the fish's head, but basically the rules on how you caught fish were a lot less restrictive than they are now. We sometimes use snagging in a different way nowadays, but at the time, kind of like you could catch salmon just kind of like on the side and like get a ton. And plus there was just a lot of salmon back in like the 40s and stuff like that. And so people, random person living in what we now think of as Kenai could just go down to the river and catch a ton of salmon in one day and feed their family for the winter. By 1973, though, they'd established what we call limited entry, but basically they started to do really much more stringent fishing regulations. They made snagging, as they were using the term back then, illegal. And it's in that context that it stopped being a space primarily for commercial fishers and then people trying to feed their families. And it was around the same time that you started to see more of a birth of a sports fishing industry. Partly because people have to start using different kinds of techniques to catch the salmon, that starts turning into more of a sport. And so for kings and for some of the other salmon, working with different kinds of baits, different kinds of scents, really getting into kind of these complex techniques that you use when you can't use, a big commercial trap and you can't use a kind of traditional snagging method. People started to get a lot more creative, and that fed into the tourism industry. For a few decades, they'd already been doing like trout catching and stuff at Kenai Lake, but 70s are really when it starts to take off as far as salmon fishing. By 1980, you establish a technique that's famous around here called the Kenai flip. By 82, the guides become really highly professionalized, where like they are required to register with the state. They like do like a training actually, one of which we run here at the Kenai Peninsula College. By 84, they had established what's called the Kenai River Special Management Area. By 96, people that have a guide take them out is now bigger than people that just go by themselves to go king salmon fishing on the Kenai. So salmon, so starting in the 70s and then certainly by the 90s, we have a really big kind of guided salmon fishing thing where people are coming typically from lower 48 or other parts of the world to come have a guided experience, and a guide that will take them, show them where to catch salmon, show them these special techniques of how to catch the salmon here, and so forth. This is our kind of first professional salmon guide. Not really, though. There's actually an Alaska Native woman who had been doing some fishing guiding a little earlier than that. Alaska Nelly, but anyways, I think it was Alaska Nelly. I might be getting names mixed up, and if so, I apologize. I also forget this guy's name. So, hi, one of our first professional guides. Bye, one of our first professional guides. Okay. At the same time as sports fishing is kind of developing and becoming a major thing, there's these complex issues with subsistence fishing. I won't overly get into this. It's a very complicated issue, and I don't want to oversell this. I don't want to oversimplify it. But I will say that there was a lot of legal back and forth related to subsistence fishing. In 1973, Governor Egan had promised to protect native subsistence rights. In 1971, a date I don't have on here, but in INCSA, in theory, INCSA preserved native fishing rights for lands surrounding not just the lands of native corporations, but lands around there, kind of people's traditional fishing places. 1978, Alaska legislature passed a subsistence priority where rural residents, if there did have to be restrictions on salmon being caught, rural residents got priority. 1980, the feds passed a law called INILCA, which also had a subsistence priority, but the Board of Fishing changed it, so established that Cook Inlet / Kenai would not be considered a subsistence area, which follows this weird pattern of sometimes counting that as a non-rural area, which I will be, might seem very strange to you if you're from places in the lower 48, probably Kenai River area seems relatively rural. 1985, though, this gets taken to court. It was actually taken to court a few times, but basically gets taken to court, the whole rural subsistence priority thing. And then the court decided with the people that were doing the litigation and said that they could not do a rural priority, that was discrimination. And so then we were out of compliance with the federal law. So in 1986, the Alaska legislature tried to define it in such a way that they'd be in line with it. In the McDowell case of 86, that got stricken down, and they were once again out of compliance with INILCA. In 1988, the Ninth Court again determines that, hey, wait a second, you're not actually following INILCA. So it's just this legal complex situation that's going on, where there was attempts to preserve a rural priority and then attempts to tear down a rural priority. A rural priority, of course, would have established priority subsistence rights for certain communities, many of which, not all, but many of which would have been native communities. At the same time, you have this complicated thing going on with federal lands and subsistence, including the Katie John court cases, who was an Ottawa woman who was not allowed to fish on her traditional fishing grounds of her community, and who took this to court. And it ended up going back and forth, ultimately decided in her favor. The governor was going to push it further, but he visited Katie John and they had a conversation, and he basically came out of it convinced to not push the matter any further and allow the court case to stand. But by the late 90s, since Alaska is out of compliance with federal law on this subsistence issue, you end up getting the establishment of a very strange system in Alaska, which we call dual management, where some waters are managed by the state and some waters are managed by the feds. So very complicated, and it's certainly an ongoing and evolving issue. So and I hope I haven't oversimplified the matter there. Some of the points I want to make, though: sports fishing is a major economic driver in Kenai River communities like Cooper Landing, like Kenai, like Soldotna, others as well that I'm not mentioning, partly for brevity, but that would certainly be worth mentioning. I should have mentioned Sterling, I should have mentioned Kasilof, but sports fishing is major in these areas. At the same time, when we talk about fishing as a tourism industry, you need to understand it in a much larger kind of anthropological context. That anthropological context includes the fact that the user groups, as they sometimes get called, notice that's sort of loaded language, but anyways, the user groups are much more complicated. It includes commercial fishers. It also includes subsistence users, of a variety of different cultural backgrounds, but subsistence users, and also that commercial use in sports fishing are predated by subsistence use that goes back millennia, right? So you kind of have to understand tourism within a broader framework, which I don't think I'm taking a particular stance on, just saying that that's important to remember as we try to untangle these puzzles of what tourism is in Alaska today, the goods, the bads, and the ugly, I suppose. So thank you very much for your time. Bye-bye.